There are plenty of characters in Berserk whose lives feel like they've been predetermined to go through living hell. Guts and Casca immediately come to mind when we say that phrase, but it's also true for most other characters we meet as well. Jill, Rosine, Farnace, Serpico, heck, even Isidro have been through things that have culminated in their fated encounters with the Black Swordsman. But there is one character who literally could not have avoided being tied into the story of our main trio. And what makes his life especially tragic is the fact that we weren't even aware he'd been created. The Demon Child debuted in Berserk all the way back in its first chapter, but its existence wouldn't be explained until the end of the Golden Age arc. And when it was, you can bet that we were just as horrified as our protagonist was in that moment. But what exactly is this child? Who are its parents? And why is it so important to the story? We'll answer all that and more in this video. This is the Demon Child / Moonlight Boy's origins, explored. Before we get into our explanation, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He's introduced as an enigmatic specter that haunts Guts at his most vulnerable, Demon Child in the Black Swordsman arc. If you stopped reading Berserk after the Black Swordsman arc, and we don't know why you would, you'd think that the Demon Child was yet another torment inflicted upon Guts by series creator Kentaro Miura. That's because though there are hints pointing towards a connection between the two, they're very subtle. And mostly, the Demon Child just plays a rather antagonistic role in the Black Swordsman arc, in that it reminds Guts of his powerlessness in his most vulnerable situations. The first time the Demon Child appears in Berserk is in the very first chapter, titled The Black Swordsman. After laying and slaying an apostle, in that order, Guts arrives at the city of Koka looking for his next target. His investigation leads him to an inn, where he spots an apostle's thugs harassing an elf and sees a golden opportunity. He makes quick work of the group of thugs in Koka City's inn, leaving a single survivor to deliver his message to their master, that the Black Swordsman had arrived. Saving Puck was simply incidental, and Guts made it very clear to the cheerful and upbeat elf. In fact, he was so rude to the little guy that he ran off at the first sight of trouble, because Guts' actions ended up drawing the attention of the city guard. He was taken captive and tortured near senseless, being thrown into a musty prison cell afterward where his captives no doubt hoped that he would die. As he'd lie on the ground suffering from his wounds, unable to even make sense of where he was, the Demon Child appeared right in front of his eyes. It was, objectively speaking, the most disgusting character we'd seen in Berserk from a design standpoint. And yes, we're including the female apostle from the beginning of this chapter. The child was grotesque, with a tumor-like growth covering his right eye and plague spots circling his mouth. His spine seemed to want out of his skin, his limbs ended in tendrils, and he even had a tail. Guts seemed to recognize the child, as his inner monologue said, "You again," upon seeing him in the cell. But as the child crawled its way toward him, it became clear that he wanted nothing to do with it, as he screamed for it to get away from him. The child gave Guts a look that almost looked sad before disappearing just as Puck arrived to the Black Swordsman's rescue. The next time we see the Demon Child is in a nightmare Guts has in the second chapter of the series titled The Brand. And this is mostly why we say the Demon Child appeared to be an antagonist in the early stages of Berserk. After dealing with the Snake Baron, whose men were the one Guts had killed in that inn we spoke of, the Black Swordsman went on his way towards his next target. Neither Hellfire nor Rain could have stopped his feet from taking him where he needed to go, and the latter tried particularly hard that day. Guts was offered a ride by a father-daughter duo traveling in a carriage, and he dozed off in the back, with Puck once again giving him company. No sooner had he slept, though, than we saw him enter a nightmarish landscape. Trapped between two walls with seemingly endless paths extending either side of him, Guts was being gazed at by a single eye, high above in the sky. He tried to run away from it, but ended up impaling his foot on some spikes coming out of the ground. As Guts struggled to free himself, his brand of sacrifice started bleeding, and a massive representation of the Demon Child popped up behind him. It told him that he cannot run, as it leapt at Guts and woke him from his nightmare. Turns out this was the job of an incubus that had snuck onto the wagon, but it still bears weight in our opinion. We know that the brand of sacrifice only bleeds in the presence of malign entities tied into the astral world, so the fact that the Demon Child made his brand bleed in his nightmare gives us the impression that it too is somehow working against him. The final time we see Guts encounter the Demon Child is once again when his guard is all the way down. After witnessing the execution and dying request of Vargas, the physician whose actions put a behelit in Guts' possession, the Black Swordsman was reeling. He was about to physically throw up in an alleyway due to the sheer inhumanity of what he'd just seen when the demon child showed up once more. It appeared at the crossroads of another alley and started walking away from Guts, but just before it moved out of sight, its head turned into Vargas's, exacerbating the Black Swordsman's internalized guilt. These 3 encounters are all we got from Guts and the Demon Child for nearly 100 chapters, between the start of the Golden Age and the end of the Eclipse, but they did give us some ideas as to their relationship. Number 1. Guts knew the Demon Child and was clearly repulsed by it, and number 2, this kid had some connection to the God Hand. The entire point of the Black Swordsman arc was to set up the Apostles and the God Hand as the main antagonists of the series after all, and this baby with a literal demon tail was clearly a part of that infernal species of evil. The reasons behind both of our observations would be revealed in the aftermath of the eclipse, and to say that they were disturbing and not what we expected would be an understatement at the very least. The corrupted seed of a love torn asunder blooms into a cursed flower. The Demon Child's birth. The reasons behind both of our observations stem from a single disgusting act of dominance and violation, and if you guys know anything about the eclipse, then you know where we're going with this. In chapters 46 and 47, titled Wounds Part 1 and 2, Guts and Casca overcome their differences and realize that they love each other. Both warriors lay their deepest insecurities out in the open, and are accepted by the other, leading to an encounter that was both emotionally and narratively satisfying for us as readers. Guts and Casca had terrible lives even before being found by Griffith. As mercenaries, they had put their lives on the line every day for years on end. And through that, Guts and Casca had forged a bond that even they didn't realize ran deeper than camaraderie. The culmination of their love is one of the reasons why many Berserk fans call the manga a love story, because ultimately, Guts and Casca's love for each other ends up saving them from their loneliness, which had come to define their characters up until that point. What's surprising is that this was the first time either of them had slept with anyone, which is what makes what happens next both shocking and terrifying. Guts had been trained in the art of the sword since he was 6 years old, but he'd never really gotten to have the talk with anyone in his life, so of course he didn't know anything about pulling out and such, and because Casca had never slept with anyone either, we doubt she knew the proper risks of what had just happened. If she did, she probably wouldn't have set out on a whole-ass rescue mission to free Griffith from captivity after spending a year on the run because of his actions. Guts had not just affirmed his love for Casca that night under the trees, he'd also impregnated her, and unwittingly laid the seed of a new life. So when Casca's womb ended up being violated by the newly born God Hand member Femto, that seed ended up being corrupted. Griffith's inhuman assault on the very person he had once saved from the acts he was committing to her affects not just her sanity, but her womb as well. Femto's evil seed mingles with the fetus that was still taking shape within her to create a new form of life. Of course, neither Guts nor Casca were aware of the latter's pregnancy, and ascertaining the same was going to be especially difficult now that Casca's mind had been regressed. If it hadn't been for the Skull Knight, Guts would have probably never even realized that he had become a father. After the Wandering Wraith saved Guts and Casca from being finished off alongside their sacrificed comrades, he brought them to Godot's ore mine, unaware of a connection between the place and the people he was carrying. Skull Knight brought them there because he knew the mine to have been inhabited by elves once, and thus knew it was the only safe place for someone as defenseless as Casca. As Guts and Casca recovered, he told Rickert to tell them not to leave the cave for obvious reasons. But Guts ends up leaving, obviously. He runs for a while, trying to sweat out his traumas, but ends up being beset by evil dead spirits from all sides. Skull Knight shows up once again and gives him a sword to fight with, but in the middle of Guts' war declaration, the spirits end up rushing away from him. Guts is confused as to how this could have happened, but Skull Knight informs him that the dead spirits weren't gone, they had just found a new light to attach themselves to. The Black Swordsman immediately realizes what this means and rides with the Skull Knight to where the spirits had gathered around Casca. Guts made to rush towards her, but his traveling companion stopped him because he noticed something was odd. There were dozens of spirits gathered around Casca, but somehow they were not attacking her like they were Guts. They just hung around her, as if circling her in anticipation of something. Guts didn't care. He rushed to Casca's side and immediately asked her if any of the spirits had hurt her, but something even stranger was going on. Casca's eyes were glazed over, as if she was mindless in that moment, even more so than her regressed condition due to the eclipse's events. No sooner had Guts began to shake her for reassurance that she keeled over, clutching her belly and screaming in agony. With the power of hindsight, we know now that this was the onset of labor, but as we were reading this chapter, it was really hard to tell. Casca grabbed Guts' arm as hard as she could and struggled for what felt like an eternity before a small, malformed thing fell out of her birth canal. The thing was no bigger than a palm, all covered in blood and with only a single eye besides, but as soon as it came out of Casca, it opened said eye, and Guts instinctively knew that this was a demon. He tries to kill it, but to his bafflement, Casca leaps over the fetal creature as if to protect it. Guts tries to take her off of it and go in for a second stomp attempt, but Skull Knight's words stop him. The wandering wraith informs Guts that the reason behind Casca protecting this demonic spawn that came out of her womb was simple. It was her child. Unbeknownst to either of them, Casca was with child when she entered the eclipse, and her defilement by the newest member of the God Hand corrupted her child with the seed of evil. Skull Knight informs Guts that this was why the child had been possessed by evil and was a cursed child that was best dealt with ASAP, as it was sure to bring woe upon both Guts and Casca. But as he's saying this, Guts realizes that this must mean he's the actual father of this baby. He's so shocked by this revelation that he tells Skull Knight to shut his trap as he tries to process this new information. Just then, the demon child crawls up Casca's bosom and starts licking at her brand of sacrifice, which, curiously enough, is not bleeding at all. Guts immediately grabs the baby and snatches it away from Casca. Despite knowing that this was his baby, his internal thought processes continues to condemn the demon child as one of those who devoured their comrades. Guts fully intends to finish the job he began on his third attempt, but Casca tries to rabidly protect the child out of a base motherly instinct. Just as the branded pair begin struggling over their offspring, the first proper retcon of Berserk takes place as the demon child disappears with the sunrise. In the chapter Guardian Angels of Desire Part 2, he appeared in an alleyway that was illuminated by sunlight and actually moved towards the sun as opposed to going away from it as a demon was now wont to do in the world of Berserk. But putting that little detail aside, don't let Guts' 3 attempts at offing his own baby make you think he hated the kid or something. You have to understand that Guts was at the peak of his post-eclipse rage here, going through the night of terrors that was about to become his daily life for the first time. When he saw Casca giving birth to a literal demon, he didn't even wait to think whose child it was, because he only saw it as a demon. Once the realization struck him, he clearly hesitated from taking his own child's life, as he contemplated the demon child's nature with Casca biting on his arm. And when the baby disappeared with the sunlight, Casca broke down, and Guts had a tear welling up in his one good eye. Many people have interpreted this as being yet another sign of Guts' regret at Casca having gone insane, but we think it's him understanding how truly helpless he was now for the first time. He didn't even know he'd gotten Casca pregnant, and now that he did, he nearly treated his child like Gambino had treated him all those years ago. We don't think this became immediately evident to Guts until a while later, and we just want to clarify that Guts trying to kill the demon child isn't an indication of him being a terrible father, it's a representation of him rejecting everything that happened at the eclipse. He refuses to even acknowledge the child in his thoughts until much later in the story, and perhaps that is why it kept showing up in front of him randomly throughout his days as the feared Black Swordsman. We were wondering why this grotesquely huge infant was appearing in front of Guts at his lowest points during the Black Swordsman arc, and the answer turned out to be far more disturbing and heartbreaking than anything we were prepared for. After the demon child's disappearance with the sunrise, Skull Knight walks over to Guts and Casca and puts 2 and 2 together. He tells Guts not to think that the baby's disappearance means it has died. It has simply slipped into the same interstice as the malign spirits of the dead. He tells Guts that someday the child will return to see them both again, because all children yearn for their parents, even demons in their own way. He bids Guts farewell after giving him a warning about the life in front of him. And we know that his words rang true since the beginning of the series. The reason behind the demon child appearing in front of Guts was because it basically couldn't visit Casca. After this night of terrors, Guts decided to wage a one-man war against demonkind, and left Casca trapped inside of Godot's ore cave like a prisoner. For 2 years she stayed there, while the demon child continued to appear to Guts during the night, when he was at his lowest, just to receive a father's love. We've already spoken about his appearances during the Black Swordsman arc, but it continued into the Lost Children arc as well. After killing a bunch of Rosine's pseudo-apostle elves, Guts faces off against the self-proclaimed queen herself, but ends up coming up short thanks to her sonic burst and poisoned elf dust. Once Rosine departs the scene with her remaining elves, the ones who died at Guts' hands revert to their human forms as apostles, and their pseudo-spawn are wont to do. The Black Swordsman is forced to take yet another child hostage in order to stage his escape, and once he does, he pushes away both Jill and Puck in an attempt to kill Rosine alone. But, poisoned and losing blood, Guts knows he needs to rest for at least one night and do some emergency med work to even stay functional. He skins a snake, drinking its blood and eating its flesh to counter the poison running through its veins, and consumes some cocoa leaves to keep him moving through the night of terrors. But just as soon as it begins, Guts is stunned into immovability. Usually, the spirits attacking him are formless and 100% malignant, intending to take over his warm body to soothe their cold, rotting souls. But this time, things were different, as Guts was faced by the ghosts of the pseudo-apostles he'd slain to save Jill's village, and leading them, at least in his mind, was his own kid. The demon child appeared to his father once more in the bonfire Guts had started to keep himself awake throughout his nightly vigil, and was once again forced to defend himself against his father. Guts brought Dragon Slayer down at the bonfire, annoyed at the kid's ability to get under his skin, but the demon child simply levitates and disappears, leaving his father to deal with the consequences of his actions. It is evident that the attempt at forming a bond between these two characters is rather one-sided, but that doesn't mean they don't share a connection at all. Both the demon child and Guts love the same person, Casca, and they were willing to do anything to protect her and keep her safe. Sadly, neither father nor son knew just how final their last encounter was going to be. If they did, perhaps there's a chance that Guts would have at least tried to atone for trying to stomp out the demon child like he was Seth Rollins immediately after its birth. Fierce protector and unplanned participant of the incarnation ceremony. How the demon child became Berserk's most pivotal character. Despite Guts' hatred for his own offspring, it was clear that at least one of the demon child's parents loved it. When he was born, Casca immediately clutched him in her arms and tried to nurse him before he disappeared into the night air. In the 2 years that the child followed Guts around, we're pretty sure he wanted to see his mother as well. He just literally couldn't because of elfin magic. So when Casca escaped Godot's ore mine for good, the demon child finally got the chance to reunite with its mother, but not before leaving his father with an ominous prophecy. Yes, we said prophecy, because this baby was quite possibly one of the most powerful characters in all of Berserk at the tender age of 2 in a few months. We've already seen the demon child use levitation to protect itself from threats to its person. Because of his inherent astral nature, he can only take shape in the physical world when the sun goes down, or in parts of the world that are covered in complete darkness. The demon child seems to have a degree of influence over evil spirits, as during his birth, none of the spirits circling Casca dared touching her, unlike with Guts, where they immediately tried to possess him. And, to top it all off, he also seems to be cognizant of Causality's grand plan, because this kid was spitting bars like he was SK or Void when he appeared in front of Guts in Revelations Part 3. After escaping the Holy Iron Chain Knights and dealing with Farnace's pre-enlightenment BS, Guts wanders from town to town looking for shelter. But everywhere he goes, he finds the same horrifying scene waiting for him. Streets abandoned, bodies piled up in churches, and paranoid eyes staring at him through the windows of houses that were practically boarded up. Puck encourages him to get some shut-eye near a rock formation that is eerily reminiscent of Stonehenge, and Guts agrees because he's been running on no sleep for 2 days. But as he dozes off underneath the sun, his mind shows him images of a pillar with the Holy See insignia sitting on top of it, buried in a pile of kindling. He sees torches, a pair of chained hands, and faces that look disturbingly similar to the spirits he eats for dinner every night. He then sees a vision of Casca being bound to the aforementioned pillar, as the pyre beneath it is lit aflame by the hands holding those torches we talked about, and that snapped him out of his sleep. Guts wonders if this was the work of those pesky incubi, but turns out this vision was given to him by his son. The demon child manifests in front of Guts in a shaded bit of rock formation, and the Black Swordsman is immediately apprehensive of his arrival. Guts thinks that the babe is trying to pull some new fiendish trick on him when the demon child transforms its own face into that of Casca, but his assumptions are proven dangerously wrong by his son's next words. The child warns Guts that danger will become imminent when the sky falls over holy ground and blind sheep erect a pillar of fire. While he is saying this, Casca's face lights up with flames, and the child departs by urging his father to hurry and get to holy ground quickly. Guts doesn't understand his prophecy at first, but when he puts two and two together, he realizes that Casca is in dire need of his help. His realization is reaffirmed by his visit to Godot and a visit from the Skull Knight, who pretty much echoes the demon child's prophecy with a bit more context. He rushes to the holy ground of St. Albion post-haste, but his son beats him to the punch. The demon child shows up in front of Casca for the first time in over 2 years, when malign spirits of the dead buried in the shadow of the Tower of Conviction are attracted to her brand. Casca, who is practically mindless and with Nina at the time besides, is unaware of the danger approaching her. She never even learns of it because before she is set upon by corpses clamoring for salvation, the demon child shows up to protect his mother. With a single look, he is able to get the dead spirits to leave the corpses they'd animated and go far away from his mom, whom he yearned to reunite with. But the child remembered what Guts' reaction was to seeing him after so long, and didn't want to experience the same thing from both parents, so it disappeared into the night sky once again. His actions did not go unnoticed though, as the egg of the perfect world bore witness to everything that transpired, and this marked a turning point in the story. Up until this point, only one person had been shown to be able to resist the flow of causality, and that was Guts. Zod told him he'd die, and then Skull Knight told him the same thing in their first encounter, but he was still alive and standing on his own 2 feet. Yes, he often finds himself tangled with those whose feet are guided by the causal current, as Puck puts it, but his own are guided by his personal will. Guts is like a leaping fish that keeps breaching the current that is Berserk's idea of fate, and so naturally, that nature is passed down to his son as well. Throughout the Conviction arc, the demon child seems to have 2 distinct purposes. Number 1, protect Casca, and number 2, prevent causality. So far, every vision and prophecy relating to the incarnation ceremony had seen the Pillar of Fire being set aflame, and Casca along with it. It's rather similar to the omens that Guts received prior to the eclipse from Zod and the Skull Knight. So, in order to prevent his mother from meeting such a grisly end, the demon child dedicates all of its time and energy in St. Albion to protecting Casca. He shows up outside the cave of the Flame Goddess cult to protect his mother from malign spirits that were summoned there by her brand of sacrifice, and vanishes as soon as its job was done. The demon child then resurfaces in the Tower of Conviction, when Casca was put in an Iron Maiden, and her blood-curdling scream triggered the blood flow of the dead. Those bloody blobs of man-eating malice began engulfing everything and everyone present in St. Albion as they were let loose from its very foundations. But they couldn't touch Casca because the demon child was protecting her. He used his immense demonic powers to keep the evil spirits and Mozgus's god breath away from Casca, but the sheer numbers disadvantage ended up draining him entirely. The demon child was on the brink of death, covered with burn marks and left to die in a hollow of the Tower of Conviction, when he was chanced upon by someone exactly like him. This is when he made a massive splash through the current of causality, and not even by his own choice. As the child awaited the cold embrace of death, it was encountered by a mortally wounded Egg of the Perfect World, who'd been observing the boy's movements all this time. The Behelit-shaped apostle could instinctively sense that the demon child was also headed in the same direction as him when it came to their lives, and in that instance, he empathized with the baby. So much so that the Egg of the Perfect World swallowed the demon child in the hopes of giving it comfort in the cradle of the new world, as they both passed away from the old one. But we think that this move was not preordained by causality, because it ended up creating a massive bug we'll address in just a bit. For now, as far as the Egg of the Perfect World was concerned, he'd just performed a humane act. The demon child now resided in the same incubation chamber that was integral to the incarnation ceremony, and as a result, became an unwitting part of it. The Behelit apostle continued its climb towards the summit of the Tower of Conviction, but its body looked different. Glowing within its now transparent flesh was the demon child, and Guts barely caught a glimpse of him on his way down the side of the tower to go stab Angel Mozgus and save Casca. When he came out of his rage, he realized what he'd seen, and jerked his head back to the top of the tower, seemingly searching for his son, but his attention was recalled by Mozgus, who went into his fully released state. As the battle between the White Angel and the Black Swordsman raged on beneath, the Egg of the Perfect World nested itself atop the Tower of Conviction and planted its root-like tendrils firmly within the palm of the God Hand created by the blood flow of the dead. As the Behelit apostle relished the fact that everyone who ever despised him would soon be digested in the incarnation ceremony, he wondered if the demon child could hear the lullaby of the new world from within its cradle, as we see the baby having been transformed into a human child for the most part. When we saw this the first time, we were confused. Why would Miura turn the kid into a human baby at this critical juncture where it seems like Femto is about to return to the physical world? And then it struck us. It was because the demon child was the vessel for his incarnation, or at least part of it. As the blood flow of the dead rushed into the incubating body of the egg of the perfect world, it rapidly matured the demon child's human body into the visage of Griffith. And just like that, a god hand now existed within the physical world. For a long time, the Berserk fandom had assumed that this meant the demon child was now dead, or at the very least, it only had a peripheral influence over this new Falcon of Light. In chapter 178, titled Reunion on the Hill of Swords, Griffith meets Guts and Rickert for the first time since the eclipse. Guts is understandably pissed by his flagrancy. Rickert is confused by his companion's rage, but Griffith is just here to confirm something. When he descended within the abyss and was transformed into a god hand by the idea of evil, he was told that he had now shed his last tear, and that his heart was crystallized forever following his reincarnation. Griffith confirms this to be true by appearing in front of Guts, who was the object of his hatred and longing, and realizing that he doesn't feel a single thing in his presence. But when Guts' fight with Zod ends in a bloody stalemate for him, Griffith notices his heartbeat. Later, when their fight sends a boulder flying in Casca's direction, Griffith ends up protecting her as if out of a primal instinct, and his internal monologue reveals that this was because of the demon child's influence on him. The child, whose heart yearned for its parents, ended up acting out in their favor, and as soon as Griffith realized this, he called off the fight and flew away. A fair few years passed between this chapter and the next appearance of the demon child, so it was kind of accepted by the fandom that the lad's struggle against Falcon evil here was going to have to be internalized, until he showed up in a brand new form. The boy of the moonlight who is Griffith's ephemeral dream. How the demon child became Berserk's most important character. Guts doesn't think about his child or anything besides Casca's safety ever since he temporarily allowed his beast of darkness to overtake him, which is probably why he doesn't immediately realize that the demon child and the moonlight boy are the same people. But to be fair to him, we only know this because of the power of hindsight. Chapter 238 opens with the conclusion of Guts and Skull Knights meeting upon a moonlit beach on the former's journey to Vertanis. The wandering wraith gives the black swordsman hope by telling him that if he reaches Elfhelm, then its ruler could help restore Casca's mind, but also warned him that ultimately his wish might not be her wish. Immediately after this, we cut to Casca walking mindlessly on the beach when she comes across a pale-skinned, dark-haired child. The two instinctively form a mother-child bond, and our first hint that this was in fact the demon child was Shirkei detecting a mysterious ode coming off of him. Miura covered it up by having her think the child was an emissary from the Flower Storm Monarch, but then he also doubled down by giving Guts and Casca quite possibly their only family moment. Ever since the branded girl met the Moonlight boy, she started behaving as if she was his mother. The person who usually needed to be tended to was now doing the tending, as she ran around the boy trying to feed him and keep him still. Guts was quite baffled by the boy's appearance, and the boy appeared apprehensive of him at first, but then he climbed on Guts' back in order to get his father to play. The apprehension probably came from the fact that Guts was cleaning his knife, but once the child understood that he wasn't going to be stabbed by them, he decided to let loose. Guts, of course, was having none of it, and peeled the Moonlight boy off his face, but Casca thought he was going to hurt the kid, so she leapt at him. Guts dropped the boy directly over his knives, so he dove to save him too. Both of them caught the child at the same time, causing Isidro to exclaim that the three of them looked kind of like a family. Once again, with hindsight, we knew just how correct he was. But the appearance of the boy and the instinctive bond he shared with Casca made Guts think of his demon child for the first time since the incarnation ceremony. He recalled the child being rushed to the summit of the Tower of Conviction, and wondered if he was still wandering out there somewhere, unaware that the kid was right beside him. A long time ago, Skull Knight had told him that all kids yearn to love and protect their parents, even demons, and Guts remained unaware of just how much protection his son had given him for over 100 chapters. Shortly after thinking about his demon child, Guts sensed the presence of evil astral creatures nearby. Turns out these were Ganishka's Pishachagana introducing themselves to the Black Swordsman party, but none of them knew this at the time. Guts went berserk during the fight as he took out multiple crocodile and Makara familiars, but the Moonlight boy also strangely possessed the power to protect his people. When a familiar approached him and Casca, the Moonlight boy repelled it with a single look. Later, it was his astral body that calmed down Guts in his berserker state by reminding him what was important. Casca. The Black Swordsman realizes this, but doesn't say anything to Shirkei or the rest. The next morning, After the full moon had faded into the morning sky, the boy had disappeared, and everyone was confused. He reappeared at the next full moon when Guts and co were at Isma's Island, where he once again saved his dad from certain death. As Guts lay victorious within the sea god's body, his wounds caught up with him, and he started to drown alongside his infernal deity. Shirke, who had been accompanying him with her astral body so far, was knocked out of him by the impact of the sea god's death, so she couldn't help him. Isma and her Marrow brethren tried using echolocation to find Guts' position, but they couldn't reach him. As the Black Swordsman braced for death in a worthless place like the sea god's heart chamber, the Moonlight boy suddenly showed up and started guiding him to safety. Guts commented on the child's playful nature and how it seemed to show up whenever he was at his most vulnerable state. If he'd stopped to think about it, perhaps he'd have made the connection. But Guts was more of the swings first, ask questions later type of guy. This time, he actually sees the Moonlight boy leaving as he travels across the branches of the world spiral tree after giving his parents a look that screamed of longing. We don't know if Guts thought he was hallucinating or not when he saw this, because it happened right after his vision went blurry from him overusing the Berserker armor, but we'd like to think he noticed it. And yet, this was also one of our final red flags about the Moonlight boy's identity, as the very next person shown to be able to navigate the world tree was, you guessed it, Griffith. After reaching Elfhelm, Guts convinces the Flower Storm Monarch to help him restore Casca's mind. Shirke and Farnace then take the branded girl through the Corridor of Dreams, where they literally piece her sanity together bit by bit. The final fragment of Casca's shattered memory resembled the Demon Child, and once again, we think this was Miura-sensei yelling at us that the kid and the Moonlight boy were one and the same, because right after Casca woke up, the perspective shifted to the east of Falconia, where Griffith was leading his war demons in his latest scheme to keep the humans appeased. After the advent of Fantasia, the only safe place for humanity was at the base of the World Tree, which is where Griffith established Falconia. He now used the pretext of reclaiming lost territory to take out competition from this new world of horrors, starting with a few troll-leading giants who also had a pet Hydra. It was pretty cool to see Zod, Grunbeld, Irvine, and the rest get a good showing in, considering the insane hiatuses Berserk was taking around the time Chapter 356 came out. But what was really interesting was the aftermath of the conflict. Griffith asked Sonya, his medium, to locate a certain artifact for him. This artifact turned out to be a Stonehenge formation quite similar to the one Guts took shelter at when the Demon Child warned him about the incarnation ceremony. Apparently, these formations were actually gateways that allowed a person connected to the astral world to travel the branches of the world tree, and this is where the connection between the Moonlight boy and Griffith was practically spelled out for us. When the reborn band of the Falcon returns to Falconia in an instant, thanks to the discovery of what is essentially fast travel checkpoints for Berserk, Mule is brimming with ideas for future campaigns. He says that it would be extremely useful to have sky paths like this, because it would save a lot of time, energy, and effort for military deployment. And while Sonya agrees, she points out that it's impossible to do without her or Griffith in the lead. She says that only people with special perception can see through the countless branches of the tree and make out the correct path towards their destination. Of course, we know that the world tree is the dragon path of the astral world, and Sonya is really a seer in service of a literal demon king. But that's not the point of this video. The point is, not even Shirke, who is the strongest magic user outside of Falconia or Elfhelm, has been shown to be able to use the world spiral tree for traveling. So unless the Moonlight boy is an unprecedented magical anomaly that somehow all magic users of the world have failed to account for, he is who Griffith turns into on the nights of a full moon. Miura confirms this in chapter 364 when he shows us that after a day or so of frolicking with his parents, the Moonlight boy transforms into Griffith at Elfhelm, who then proceeds to kidnap Casca and wreck the island. See, after that encounter on the Hill of Swords, and going through the monthly cycle of turning into the Moonlight boy and dreaming for his experiences through his body, Griffith had figured out that the key to overcoming this weakness of his was to capture Casca. Because we know that Griffith cannot be harmed by anyone or anything in the physical world that is a part of his story, he has finessed multiple arrow volleys and killer intense swings from Dragonslayer as proof of that, but no one knows whether that same sense of being the absolute applies to the Moonlight boy or not. The Demon Child was already on the verge of death when the egg of the perfect world consumed him, and though he found a new lease on life through Griffith's incarnation, it only lasted about as long as the full moon. The Moonlight boy might just be vulnerable to weapons imbued with the ability to harm and or kill astral creatures, such as Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation, or worse yet, Guts' Dragonslayer. Recall that Guts has never clicked with his son since he was born. He knew the Demon Child was his, but he could never quite get over the demon half of him to accept him. This is why when the Moonlight boy appears, he doesn't put two and two together and doesn't realize that the reason Casca was being so motherly towards it and why it was so scared of him was because it was his child. Guts had tried to kill the demon child as soon as it was born, and had antagonized it for most of the time it followed him looking for affection. Now, just because he looked like a boy, he couldn't recognize his own son. And we're not even sure he knows that the Moonlight boy is the demon child, because he thinks that the boy is still out there somewhere, wandering the endless night. And this is where we tie everything back to causality, because the demon child has once again proven to be a fish leaping out of the water at a time juncture where causality seems to have converged. Just like how Guts surviving the apparently inescapable eclipse with Casca and simply breathing every day defies causality, we don't think the birth of this baby was a part of the God Hand's plans. We certainly don't think it being fused into Femto's vessel for a body of flesh because of an apostle's sentimentality was part of their plan. And we think that although Griffith has kept that aura of otherworldly austerity about him ever since he came back to life, he is freaking out inside because he knows that a literal meddling kid is about to snatch his dreams away from him. We think Griffith kidnapping Casca and bringing her to Falconia was a way of him getting ahead of a problem, because like many in the fandom, we think the Moonlight boy is fated for tragedy. Guts already thinks he's a father killer. He has never quite let go of Gambino's death, or the fact that he nearly violated Casca like Griffith. Right now, he is in the bowels of his despair, and no one is sure what his next action is going to be. Those who say that Guts will just get up and keep struggling are wrong, because for the first time in the entire series, he has let go of his sword willingly. If Guts does recover from this spiral, will he be willing to commit the unspeakable and go through with what Miura was seemingly setting up for the Moonlight boy before his tragic passing? Or will he manage to struggle and contend his way out of this hell as well? We'll have to wait for chapter 372 to find out. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this one. The Demon Child is one of those characters that tends to get overlooked because he was only adapted for one anime, and sadly it was the 2016 one. But he's been influencing Berserk's story since literally day one. With the next installment in the saga under Kujimori's leadership dropping next week, we can't wait to see where things go from the end of chapter 371, when Griffith returned to Falconia with Casca in his arms. It's possible that 372 will open in Falconia, and what happens then is anybody's guess. But what's your guess? Let us know about it in the comment section below, and also tell us what you thought of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you know someone who could use some Berserk content in their lives, don't forget to share this video with them. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there,